Hey everyone, welcome to a special episode of Why Should I Trust You? So today we're hosting one of our big conversations with multiple guests, this time about their perspectives on the national conversation about autism. As we've seen, Secretary Kennedy and President Trump have made finding the cause a top priority, putting autism and families coping with it front and center. Now, they've pointed to Tylenol use during pregnancy as a possible cause and sounded big alarm bells. And while many in the science community say that there's no clear proof linking the two, Americans still rush to take sides, turning what should be a medical conversation into yet another political divide. So what's really going on here? What is this moment for autism all about? Are we headed in the right direction or have we gone off track? On today's episode, we'll hear from two MAHA moms of children with autism. Joining them is Holden Thorp, the editor-in-chief of the journal Science, and Holden's a scientist who was diagnosed with autism as an adult. And then finally, we have Dr. Rachael Bedard, a physician and a science communicator who has worked with and thought a lot about caregivers for those with serious illness. It's time to move past our politics, to have a no-holds-barred conversation about Trump, Kennedy, the way we even define autism today, the push to find a cause, and what those living most intimately with autism really need. Let's get started. Hey, welcome everyone.
Welcome everybody.
Hey guys.
We have a great group today. As we mentioned, we're doing one of these big group conversations with folks from MAHA, folks from sort of scientific communications community here. And we were really interested in seeing how each person in this conversation is seeing this moment with autism in the national spotlight. But first, let's let some of our new listeners know who we are. I'm Brenda Adhikari.
Yeah, I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdulmalik.
Yeah, this is Why Should I Trust You, which is all about the breakdown of trust in public health, medicine, and science, and what we can do to reverse course and gain some of that trust back.
Yeah, so we've just finished the conversation. It was a really special conversation. We all enjoyed it. Tom, do you want to just give us a little context before we introduce our guest? Do you want to just give us a little context on where we are with this new attention on autism in this moment?
Yeah, so taking us back just to April when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. held his very first press conference as the new head of HHS, and he was unveiling the CDC's latest assessment of autism and the autism rate in America. That was the one that found 1 in 31 children today have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And you recall this press conference was the one that, Kennedy sort of set off a firestorm by saying, these kids who will never pay taxes, never hold a job, never play baseball, never write a poem. He later clarified that he was speaking about, specifically about children with severe autism. But he was clear saying, other things. He said, autism destroys families. He called it a preventable disease. And he called the progress that the scientific community had been making over years, decades, uncovering genes that play a role in the cause. He called that effort a dead end. He said, genes don't cause epidemics. You need an environmental toxin. And with that, the new health secretary pledged to find the cause of autism and to find it quickly. So flash forward to September, and most of us saw the Trump press conference at the White House, which was billed and promoted as an announcement of the cause of autism. And of course, this is the one that the president referred to studies showing a correlation between Tylenol use during pregnancy and autism, and launched into those repeated warnings that pregnant women should not take Tylenol. Those studies did not show causation. And doctors have already been on to Tylenol with women who are pregnant, acetaminophen, saying that this should be taken sparingly and really in a conversation with the doctor about what's best for that woman. Public health scientists stepped forward and said those studies don't show causation. But still, Americans got the administration's message. But what message they got really depends on your political alignment. So KFF happened to be in the field with a poll the very next day after that press conference. And they found a bit of confusion. There were equal shares of people that said it was probably true that there was this link, as there were people who said it was probably false. But when you looked at it through the prism of your political party, people were more sure. 59% of Democrats said the claim that Tylenol taken during pregnancy increases the risk of autism was definitely false, while 56% of Republicans said it's definitely or probably true that taking Tylenol during pregnancy increases the risk of a child developing autism. So we really saw science completely being interpreted through our political lens.
So then last week, Tom, this autism discussion is still going strong. During a high-profile cabinet meeting, Secretary Kennedy appeared to double down on his suspicions that Tylenol causes autism. I mean, you're going to hear from our guests today talk about, not only that press conference, but also these cabinet meetings, what they heard in the messaging and what they wanted to hear instead. And these are from people who are really interested because they're directly impacted by autism. Now, he did say that there's not proof that Tylenol causes autism, but the framing was interesting because he said, we're doing the studies to make the proof. And that's not exactly a scientific approach to doing studies, right? You do the studies to see what they find, not to make the proof or something. But he did say the evidence is, quote, so suggestive that anybody who takes the stuff during pregnancy, unless they have to, is irresponsible, end quote. We did talk a little bit about with our moms about, this idea of, feeling guilty about maybe what they've done during pregnancy that may have caused autism. He went on to tell the president, again, this is with live cameras rolling, that 2 studies had found that children who were circumcised early had double the rate of autism, and said that it was highly likely because they were given Tylenol. Now, Kenny didn't specify which studies he meant and stopped short of saying we have proof that Tylenol is doing this, but says obviously we should be paying attention to this. Now, researchers were quick to look at, what are these studies he's talking about? And they're likely referring to 2 studies, one from 2013 and one from 2015. Neither of them say that there's a causation between Tylenol and autism. And one of them never actually even mentioned Tylenol. It was just a study about circumcision. But, is all of this, and you heard from our moms that we're going to speak with, and you're going to hear from them, that is all of this a welcome break from the same old approach to autism and how they really want to move the discussion in new ways?
Yeah, exactly, Mark. We definitely tackle the issue of that press conference, but also just so much, just a bigger framing in general of this moment with autism in the spotlight. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will introduce you to a group of individuals who are, watching all of this with different, deeply personal perspectives on autism, as well as caring for loved ones with special needs. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. So like we said before the break, we have already done the conversation. It was terrific. I'm going to let the guests on the call actually introduce themselves and just little snippets, and then we'll get started with the conversation. Here are the people in the conversation and the conversation itself. We hope you enjoy it.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Phillips. I am the mother of a now teenager who has profound autism of a regressive nature. I have been working in autism research for nearly 12 years now, and I just launched my own foundation, Make a Stand for Autism, a few months ago. I'm here because this is what I like to do, and I advocate for my daughter. I am a MAHA mom, if you will. I support Kennedy. I don't agree fully, maybe with everything that he does, or sometimes I wish that his focus would shift a little bit, but I am 100% a Kennedy supporter. I am just beyond grateful that Kennedy and Trump have brought this conversation to the forefront. I feel very grateful to be living in this stage, this part of the history of autism. I feel like for the first time since I've been doing this, that we, that we have a real chance to catalyze change.
Hi, I'm Holden Thorp, and I am the editor-in-chief of Science, which is a leading scientific journal, but also produces news and commentary for the scientific enterprise, mostly not for the public, mostly for other scientists. Before that, I ran the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where there's some pretty good autism researchers for sure. When I became the chancellor of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I started having a lot of social difficulties that I thought were just, my problem and things that I should work on. I still think that, although I have a better understanding of it now. And then when I moved to Washington University in St. Louis, in a job review with a psychologist, I got a diagnosis of being on the spectrum. I didn't disclose it to anybody for 7 or 8 years. And I've made a decision the last couple of years to start talking about it publicly after talking to lots of people, including moms like Jennifer, all the way to people all the way on the neurodiversity rights side.
Hi, everyone. I'm April Robinson, and like Jennifer, I am a mom first to a son who we adopted at birth and had regressive autism as well. For us, it happened within 6 hours after his MMR vaccine. He had a 106 fever and went into a febrile seizure and basically choked to death. We brought him back, and he was not the same once we had him stabilized. So I've spent the last decade trying to recover him and have done that mostly successfully through the help of functional medicine practitioners and probably over 20,000 hours of research and going across the country and getting as much education. They tell us that moms of autistic individuals do more research than the FBI. And I'm at this point, 10 years later, I'm pretty convinced that that's, I need an honorary PhD in some form or fashion. So I started advocating once my son was probably around 4. Recently, I joined an organization called A Voice for Choice Advocacy. I definitely would categorize myself as a MAHA mom. I agree with Jennifer when she said, now this is the topic, right? We are so blessed to be in a position right now where autism, functional medicine, holistic health, clean water, getting plastics out, all of those are at the forefront.
Sorry, I'm Rachael Bedard. I am a doctor. I am not a pediatrician. I'm an internist, and I actually work at the other end of the age spectrum. My subspecialties are geriatrics and palliative care. So I take care mostly of older people and people who have serious illness or life-limiting illness. But one of my sort of main areas of clinical interest and expertise is complex communication and shared decision-making for families who are grappling with complicated illness and supporting people who are trying to navigate how their values sort of meet the recommendations they're getting from their physicians and how they navigate when there are sometimes conflict there.
So I think we want to start off by talking about this moment. Jennifer, I believe it was you that said you feel grateful to be living in this stage of autism's history. And I think it's clear, and I'm curious what you guys think, that RFK Jr., Donald Trump, they're disrupting sort of the status quo. They're disrupting maybe the phase that we've been in and our approaches to autism. We've seen that recently. We saw that with the Tylenol press conference. We saw it in the cabinet meeting, just a week ago. I'm not really asking you to kind of litigate how you felt about, this sort of suggestion that Tylenol is linked to autism as a cause, but more about stepping back and looking at this moment of change that we're in right now. Do you feel positive about the direction we're heading with autism now? Or do you feel worried about the direction we're heading in with autism now? April, why don't we start with you? How do you feel about this moment that we're in right now that's being ushered in by this new administration?
Sure. I feel really positive overall about it. You said it right, disrupting the norm, disrupting what we've been doing hasn't been working because the numbers are just staggering. So we really have to disrupt the system to start peeling back the layers of what is going on. And so this movement with MAHA and RFK kind of coming to the front and disrupting it, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. The Tylenol conversation came out, as we know, and really the administration is introducing complex issues and trying to piece these back, right? And so it is tough for people to hear, first of all, oh, Tylenol, okay, that's a trusted brand when you're in the hospital and anywhere else. But for us autism families, we know that Tylenol depletes glutathione, which is a very important thing for detox. And so that conversation really hasn't been had. So for me, it's exciting because I have been studying this for so long. And I really, my wheelhouse is the functional medicine holistic root cause, trying to peel that back to help the symptoms of autism for my son. And I've been very successful at doing that. My son was nonverbal after the vaccine injury. He couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, he couldn't eat without projectile vomiting, and he developed a seizure disorder. And so over the last 10 years, using a lot of the things that MAHA is bringing out, really, and it's a less is more aspect of cleaning up our water, cleaning up our environment, taking out ultra processed foods and processed foods. And here in California, we just passed a bill, which was really exciting with the MAHA movement. It was AB 1264 to start taking out ultra processed foods out of school lunches. So with the MAHA movement, we are starting to really rattle the cage in that way to look at these things. So I'm excited to get a seat at that table to say, yeah, this is really what's worked for me, and to really start working with moms, helping support this movement by saying, hey, we're a family that this has really worked. My son went from nonverbal, severe, profound autism to now he's in a regular classroom. For a family like ours, we're super excited to have these conversations to say, yeah, I want more of this.
Jennifer, what's your reaction to kind of where we are right now? When you see these press conferences, you see Kennedy and Trump, do you feel assured and you feel good, we're moving in the right direction, or do you feel this is taking a turn backwards?
I mean, it's usually a little bit bittersweet, I mean, from the outside looking in, you're like, say this, don't say this, and I think it's always a little bit imperfect, but I want to take maybe the Tylenol press conference and use that as an example. So I think something that probably everybody on this podcast agrees with, and the greater medical and autism community at large, is that autism is a very, very complex, heterogeneous condition. So that even the best scientists in the world don't fully understand and cannot fully articulate to anybody. So to try and articulate that message or come up with messaging that reflects the whole spectrum is almost nearly impossible. But we have to be able to take what they're trying to do is they're trying to, I believe, frame this as something that is underfunded in terms of environmental research, that it's mediated by outside things. It's not just genetic. There's hope for these kids if we can advance some of this research. So yes, it's very complex and it's very heterogeneous, but we have to be able to talk about it's multifactorial, and we have to be able to talk about those singular factors without being faulted for not addressing autism in its entirety, because these are like little pieces of the puzzle, right? I don't think that they're fear mongering. Let me just say this. If I were pregnant right now, and this is not causal, they haven't found a causal link, but if I were pregnant right now, I would want someone to grab me and say, just so you know, there are some red flags where Tylenol is concerned. Does that mean if you have an extremely high fever that you shouldn't take it? There's not a risk there? No, it doesn't. But should you take it for a headache? Should you take it for some other, maybe that answer is no. And I think that we deserve to be informed. So on the one hand, sometimes I think that the political incorrectness or the abrasiveness of the message that is given, it gives the media a reason to tear down the overarching important message and to fault the people who are giving it for that. But at the same time, it also gets your attention and it puts it at the forefront. So, and I think that sometimes that's necessary. So I think that the messaging will continue to be imperfect, but Tylenol is but one example of something that could be contributing to autism, and we have to be able to talk about that.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. I wonder if I can go to Holden next.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Jennifer just said, which is that a lot of the rhetoric that we're getting from the president and from Secretary Kennedy is neglecting the complexity and breadth of autism. I mean, whether you like it or not, the way the diagnostic criteria are set up right now, I have an autism diagnosis, and so does Jennifer's daughter. Now, this is problematic in many ways, and some people feel it's helpful in other ways. The way in which I find it to be problematic is that we can see in the genetics that there are different subtypes that are easily identified between those of us who are on the mild end of and by the way, I'm if you want to say I'm on the mild end of the spectrum, or even I have Asperger's, or I just have a high number of autistic traits compared to the general population. I'm okay with all of those things. There are other people who are in my category who feel passionately in a different way. But as far as I'm concerned, those things all make sense. And I have nothing but the utmost respect and admiration for Jennifer and April and all the other parents that I've met who take care of children and adults with much higher support needs than many of us. So the problem with that I have with the way Trump and Kennedy talk about this is they talk about, we've been calling it profound autism. I don't object to that. They talk about profound autism as though it's the entire spectrum. And when they do that, it just breeds more of the conflict within the autism community, which we already have too much of to begin with. And so I don't like that. And I also don't like the way they talk about scientific evidence, because a lot of times they're holding a paper up and saying that there's something in that paper when it's not in there. And I'm not an expert on autism, but I'm an expert on scientific papers. And I know what's in these papers and what isn't. The press conference that actually bothered me the most was the one before, where Kennedy was talking about the autism epidemic while he was holding a CDC study that he sanctioned in his hand, that, he's saying it's not genetics and that it was, ridiculous or something like that to believe that it was genetic. But he's holding a paper in his hand that shows that the main reason for the growth was better diagnosis, and that the most important thing to do for it is to give better support. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't object to clinicians and physician scientists attempting to find ways to provide medical treatment that could perhaps restore profound autism and autism that co-occurs with intellectual disability to a better life. And I don't object to parents who want that for their children, unlike a lot of people in the neurodiversity movement. But I don't think that is something that you can apply to the large growth in autism diagnoses that we're seeing, much of which is on the milder end, where it's very, very what we call polygenic, in that there are many, many genes contributing to autistic traits, and there's not a realistic way to correct that.
Thank you, Holden. Does anyone want to respond to what Holden just said? Yeah, Jennifer, go for it.
Couple of things. I don't think that, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with this. I don't think that it really it matters as much as people talk about the rise in autism, and there are some shocking numbers. I don't think that it really matters whether it's risen or whether it hasn't. We have enough kids with profound autism whose quality of life is so poor, and that it warrants the research without any of this argument. It doesn't matter whether it's risen. I shouldn't say that. It matters. And it matters in terms of like, is it genetic? Is it environmental? All of these things. But that's kind of a moot point, because we already have enough kids with profound autism who are living this poor quality of life that should be enough to warrant the type of research that they are calling for.
Jennifer, let me ask you just a quick follow-up on that, because I think it's so interesting, because I'm sure there's a lot of families of kids living with autism who would applaud the idea that, it doesn't matter, we need resources and we need support. But I have noticed that Secretary Kennedy does talk about the rise a lot. He does talk about, and forgive me guys if I don't know, if I'm not quoting him exactly right, but I think he said something, it was from 1 in 10,000 back in decades ago, and now it's 1 in 31. And what I observe is that that statement does kind of create its own reaction thing, right? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe even rightly so, because that is astonishing if that were just because the cases were rising. And I wonder if anyone wants to just talk about that, because I hear what Jennifer's saying, that in a way we're putting too much emphasis on these numbers, but is it actually important for us to get that right? Jennifer, do you want to respond to that? And does anyone else, if you want to weigh in, just kind of raise your hand or put it in the chat?
Well, it seems like such a point of contention between everybody that it's distracting from what we need to do. I mean, I have watched, is it every 2 years they come out with the autism numbers and everyone's like, oh my gosh. But then everyone does it the next 2 years, and then the 2 years after that, and the 2 years after that. It really hasn't gotten us anywhere, except for one camp who thinks that it's rising, one camp who thinks that it's all awareness. And they're just going around and around about this. And all of these kids, meanwhile, my daughter has lost her entire childhood. So it's kind of like all of these kids are falling through the cracks while you guys are arguing whether it's increasing or whether it's not. It is what it is today. And that should warrant the kind of help and the kind of research that they are calling for. I don't see any other way forward, any other reason to continue arguing about it, that's not the responsible thing to do. The responsible thing to do is falling by the wayside while somebody's trying to be right.
I'd love for Rachael just to weigh in on what Jennifer said.
Jennifer, I think what you're saying is important, because the way that I understand the emphasis that Secretary Kennedy places on the increasing incidence and prevalence is he takes that rise in diagnoses to indicate that environmental factors are playing a huge role. Like, a big thing for him is prevalence doesn't rise that quickly due to genetic factors, because DNA doesn't change that quickly, is his argument. And that what happens is, and that if you're seeing an increase in cases like that, it points to the fact that environmental exposures are a really significant contributor. And so I think you're right that this sort of argument about what the numbers actually mean, like, does it mean that, is it about diagnostic criteria and awareness and screening? Is it about a true rise in cases, et cetera? Like, that the reason that I think that that's being emphasized so much is because he and people like in the MAHA movement, as I understand it, take that as evidence of environmental exposures playing such a significant role. And I really liked what you said earlier about how complex this is and how hard it is to communicate that in political communication contexts. Because one of the things that I feel consistently about when Secretary Kennedy says like a lot of things sort of offhand that I think make a lot of sense to you and to April and don't make a lot of sense to parents who aren't in your situation.
I think that's an important point. I think we have a lot to learn like you for that reason.
So like, you know, a few weeks or a month ago or something, you know, he made this comment about like seeing kids in the airport and he made this comment about mitochondrial dysfunction. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Like,
maybe just go over
sure,
that. Rachel,
I can't remember the exact quote, but the quote was something like, I walk through airports and I see all of these kids with like sort of glazed eyes who are overweight and like look tired and sitting there on iPads. And you know, you can tell that those kids are suffering from mitochondrial dysfunction. That statement, I know from sort of following along with sort of the MAHA-verse discourse, made a ton of sense to people who are sort of reading the same literature and following the same conversations that Kennedy follows. And then for lots of Americans, probably the majority of Americans, that comment didn't make a lot of sense. Like they didn't understand what he was referring to or talking about. So the Tylenol press conference, to me, one of the things that I thought was really challenging about it is the nuance that you're talking about, where you could hear the suggestion of the possibility of an exposure playing a role as exactly that, a suggestion of one exposure potentially playing a role. For folks who don't have your level of sophistication and background in this, the panic or reaction was like, is he saying Tylenol causes autism, right? And that's just, for everyone on this call, we sort of know that to be too concrete and direct a link to make, right? And it's not even necessarily exactly what he was saying, but it is how it's received by people who don't have the literacy around how complex this issue is. And I think that that gets at my frustration more than the suggestion that Tylenol potentially is an exposure that potentially plays a role in some kids' autism cases doesn't actually bother me that much. Like, I'm pretty interested in sort of all scientific hypotheses, and people are doing research on that question, that exact question. So like, the question doesn't bother me at all. The thing that was hard for me about that press conference was that there was like a concreteness to the way that the connection was made that I think for lots of Americans who don't have this context, not even about whether it scared them or not, it's just not helpful in helping them sort of understand the bigger picture of what has to happen to make sense of what's going on here. Do you know what I mean?
Right. And I don't want to eat up too much time because I know other people
No,
need to
go for
respond
it.
to, but again, it's very complex and it's very heterogeneous, and a lot of things might possibly go into getting somebody to an autism diagnosis. So something that I say a lot, it's not going to be vaccines cause autism. It's never going to be that simple. It's never going to be Tylenol causes autism, or fill in the blank. But if not for the blank is a powerful statement when you have watched your child regress into autism. So it was too concrete, but it's a question mark. And it's not that far-fetched. I mean, you can't take Motrin, you can't take Advil, you can't take aspirin, you can't eat deli meat, you can't eat sushi, there are a lot of things you can't do when you're pregnant. So it's not, just because it's been done for all these years doesn't mean that it's just totally far-fetched that it's now being implicated in something. What you put into your body matters when you're pregnant. And they have found population-based evidence. They have found dose-responsive evidence in cord blood. And this is from two of the most credible institutions in the United States, Harvard and Johns Hopkins. So I would say I would be grateful for somebody to say there's a red flag here. Just don't take it unless you have to, until we have some more concrete evidence. And I think that that's what they were saying. I think sometimes that they don't emphasize that enough, so it gets lost in translation with everything. But I also want to back up to like the mitochondrial thing, because I want to offer you a different perspective on that. So that really didn't make sense to me. I do think that he misspoke there. I don't think he's incorrect. I think it was just an off-the-cuff comment. My daughter has had a muscle biopsy. She has all the mitochondrial abnormalities that these kids have been found to have. You don't look at somebody's face and see mitochondrial dysfunction. I've never heard my daughter's neurologist say that. We've never talked about any kind of facial dysmorphia or anything like that. But on the same token, it's not far-fetched, because it's been estimated that like up to 86% of kids with autism have some type of mitochondrial dysfunction. So if he's making the jump in an off-the-cuff moment to say, I see these kids and I can tell they have mitochondrial dysfunction, if he's done research on that, it's just not like that far-fetched to assume that there's something like that going on there, that something about their processes or function involves mitochondrial dysfunction. Do I think that was a poor way to say that? Yes. If anyone says, I totally get that, I can see mitochondrial on this person's face, I don't believe them. I mean, that's just not something that you do. And I don't think that that's what he meant either.
Holden, let me throw one idea at you, and you take it anywhere you want. Maybe hearing Kennedy talk about Tylenol and circumcision and possible links to autism, maybe that's obviously one kind of surface way to listen to those events. But maybe there's a different way to listen to it, which is the old era of accepting this and focusing on awareness and emphasizing the strengths of children with autism. Maybe that era we're moving past that. We are focusing now on figuring out what's causing this, because we shouldn't have to live with this. The kids shouldn't have to deal with this. Families shouldn't have to deal with this. And maybe he's speaking to the families of the profoundly autistic children. Maybe that's what they want to hear. And the old way of hearing it, like our old ears, is like, wait a minute, stop. What? He can't say that. That's what's causation, what's correlation. But what families are hearing with severely autistic children is somebody's trying to fix this, do something, stop this. And that's a hero. Like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's precisely what they're doing. And I can understand why the families of profoundly autistic children, many of them, but not all, resonate with that. I think one thing that I've found is that, and people ask me all the time, do you think profound autism should be separated out and we should have a DSM-6 that has profound autism in it? And I say, look, it's not my decision. I'm somebody who's been able to, I have a lot of autistic traits, but I've been able to do a lot in life. I'll worry about my crowd. And the profound autism community should be the primary voices in this, just like the former Asperger's group thinks we should have a voice when things are done that affect us. But there are a lot of people in the profound autism community, including parents, who disagree with profound autism being carved off. And their argument is some of them feel that having autism as all one category is generally destigmatizing for autistic people, including those with severe impairment. And there are some who feel that that label underestimates the wonderful things that their children do bring to the world. All I'm doing is rehearsing the two sides of the argument for you. It's not my role to make that decision. I think people in the profound autism world should be the voices that decide that. So yeah, I think that is precisely what they're doing. I think it works very well politically. I can see precisely why it would be a politically sharp thing to do to appeal to that, because not only do you have a passionate group that you're appealing to, but these are very difficult stories that a lot of other people rightfully feel a lot of empathy and sympathy towards. I think, though, that the acceptance part is still really important for a bunch of reasons for those of us on the mild end of the spectrum, or whatever we're going to call it today, because we want lots of people to contribute to the world. And there's a lot of ableism about, how we're supposed to be. Everyone, if you're a leader, you're supposed to be able to give a great speech and make eye contact and make people feel, that you're connecting with them in ways that are hard for people with autistic traits. And I haven't met anybody in the profound autism world who disagrees, even though some neurodiversity rights activists may try to paint them this way, who disagrees with the fact that autistic traits are a real phenotype and they really do happen, and that those of us who have more of them are experiencing something. I mean, Allison Singer, I think, told me, explicitly, they're different, but neither one's more important. Now, profound autism is more important to her because she has a profoundly autistic child, but she agrees that the Asperger's phenotype is a real thing, and we should provide support to people who have that. So, and I think in terms of lowering the temperature, the irony is that a lot of people like me, and if I hadn't sort of accidentally got my diagnosis, or if I was younger and was worried about getting my next job because I was talking about the fact I was autistic, I'm perfectly okay just knowing I have a lot of autistic traits, and I wouldn't need to seek a diagnosis. And we wouldn't have as much growth in the number of autism diagnoses if people on the higher functioning end didn't feel as isolated as some do. And so I think you absolutely have to have both of these things. April and Jennifer, you can see, I mean, I think it was April said, autism moms do more research than the FBI. you can see how knowledgeable they are about the literature. And that's because they're looking for something to help their child and to advocate for them. And I don't know if we'll ever figure out a way to, gene therapy or whatever it is we're going to do for a few of these rare mutations that we can find that would help it. But I'm certainly not against it. And I hope we can. I don't think that eliminates the identity of those of us who are on the neurodiversity end of the spectrum. But I also think we desperately need more acceptance for autistic traits as being part of the human experience so that we can benefit from different ways of thinking and solving all the various challenges we have and turn down the temperature around all this autism stuff to begin with, which would help everybody.
I agree with that.
I want to get to you, April, with this one little twist.
Sure.
So I have kind of a slightly different take on that press conference, and I particularly want to hear from April and Jennifer. I personally, and I'm saying this through no evidence, okay? This is just vibes. I don't think Kennedy was ready to go out with that information that day. I think that Donald Trump pushed it way faster than I think Kennedy and Bhattacharya and Marty McCary.
But Kennedy said he'd have an answer by September.
Yeah, but then he kind of slow walked that back a little bit. But then you've got Donald Trump. He's literally at, Charlie Kirk's memorial service, guys, talking about the autism, that he's going to tease that there's a cause for autism coming up. Here's the reason why I say that. I could be wrong. Maybe someone will come back being like, no, Kennedy was really ready. I think it gets at this idea that communicating that you want to get to the bottom of it, but also communicating that there's a lot of work to be done and there's still uncertainty and we really got to make sure the research is good, is still a really good thing to communicate. Instead, in what my perception was, they kind of repackaged something that people have sort of been saying for years, which is, yeah, moms, you really shouldn't take Tylenol until you absolutely have to. That's what doctors say. Am I wrong about that, Dr. Mark? Dr. Rachel? Isn't that what doctors say?
Yes. So Brenda, was it worth it?
I think my question is, does it actually make them lose a little credibility? Because it actually would have been a really great thing to say, this is so complex, to Jennifer's point, and it is so heterogeneous, and there's so many layers to it, but we're committed to really figuring it out and not doing, I think what Tom so eloquently said, only focusing on everybody with autism deserves a life that's we deserve to see them and only give resources. There's actually there's a path towards researching the cause. I just feel like it seemed like they got ahead of their skis. April, what do you think about that?
100%. I agree. We get this one opportunity. We get this one stage. No one could have thought. So I'll back up before the announcement when we had the Senate hearing that prior Tuesday, right? Where you had Senator Johnson and you had Toby Rogers, Aaron Seary, and Jake Scott on the Senate floor talking about autism and the vaccination rates and COVID and, we had this conversation, and we had Del Bigtree that was going to come out. He had shown his trailer of, it's called An Inconvenient Study. And this is a study that Henry Ford did in 2020. It's a study that was suppressed because the findings were not favorable to what they were looking for. And it was to look at a vaccinated versus an unvaccinated population and what those health outcomes were over a longitude study. And so that trailer came out on the same day as the Senate hearing. And then tragically, Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and that momentum was sort of lost. And then we came out with this press conference, right, about Tylenol. And so to what we're saying here, it's a complex issue. Mitochondrial disorder, lack of B vitamins, MTHFR genetic mutations. We have all of these complexities around autism. And when you have environmental factors and toxins and you don't have the ability to detox because of your methylation cycle, and you have a sulfation cycle and Krebs, and you have all of these complicated things that trying to imagine President Trump coming out to explain that, or Senator Kennedy, or Secretary Kennedy, sorry, it becomes a very complicated issue. And then insert the complicated medical side with the vaccine debate, with all of these things that have gotten super polarizing and super tearing our nation apart. Even just with that conversation, it does become difficult. And so there were commitments. Trump's trying to be good on his word to say, hey, by September, and Kennedy said the same thing, by September, we'll have reasons. So then they're scrambling with everything that was going on, and like what happened with Charlie Kirk and everything else became this, okay, now we have to rush. So I agree with you where do we start, right? And they thought, okay, well, we'll talk about Tylenol, and then that will bring in this mitochondrial thing about B vitamins and luvocorin and the studies on luvocorin and how that helps children on the spectrum. Well, it's folinic acid. And it's like, we haven't even had that conversation about folinic acid and pregnancy and how things get complicated with that, with folic acid with pregnant women, right? So there's all of these things that are happening. Trump's saying, I want to go first. We said this, we were going to do this, let's come out. But to your point, it was rushed. It could have been done differently. I feel like the press conference was important, but we should have had some backup documentation or something for the American people to look at, kind of like homework to take away to say, this is really what we're talking about here with the autism. But now we're bringing in, with an inconvenient study, we're bringing back in the vaccine discussion. That study did show that there were poor health outcomes with the vaccinated population versus the unvaccinated, because it showed both sides of the coin, but it also showed how families like Jennifer and I's families have been lied to and information has been suppressed. And the fact that we don't have good scientific studies, we do not have any double-blind placebo studies longer than 5 days on the vaccines. And we don't have longitude studies for those vaccines to know that they're safe and effective. These issues become very complex because I agree with Holden. Like, we need to have studies. The science is not settled. So it becomes this larger issue.
I really appreciate your perspective on this, because I think, these studies have been talked about a lot and it's an important thing to highlight, right? So the studies that are referenced in that conference hearing, they weren't a peer-reviewed publication. The study there itself, there were a lot of flaws, and I have issues with that as a scientist, where I would like to see it meet the rigor.
Sure.
If I were reviewing that paper, I'd reject it. Sure. I think that we need to have more nuance when we talk about studies and when we bring them out. Some of the papers that have been talked about recently from RFK Jr. and others are from a while ago. And then we have bigger studies that actually prove, Tylenol's not associated, but those are not the studies that are referenced. It's these tiny studies that are really bookmark studies to get more funding. And for me, a lot of the studies that were talked about in this inconvenient study or truth, I forget what the title is, are really preying on people's fears, because there is so much safety data. There is so much efficacy data. And they've been borne out in large data sets. And we can't really go back and do the placebo double blind that people are proposing, because that would be unethical, because we know how safe and effective these vaccines are. They're the most safe and effective medical countermeasure we have. I mean, even talking Tylenol and Advil, their risk profiles are through the roof. And so I think we also kind of lost a little of the nuance when we were talking about vaccines across the board, because as a scientist, I'm not saying vaccines have no side effects. We know what the side effects are and who's at risk and what those can be correlated to. But the study that's being put forward as this breaks through all of this noise, it just isn't supporting that claim. If anything, it's diverting us from things we could actually do to help people with autism. And ultimately, again, it just shifts the blame back to mothers.
I saw Jennifer shaking her head while you were talking, Maggie. I'd love to bring Jennifer in real quick just to get your response to what Maggie was saying.
Sure. First, I would say that as a mother of a child with progressive, profound autism, I do not in any way feel like I am being blamed because Tylenol is being implicated. I watched my daughter go from connected and talking and healthy to sick and disconnected and unhealthy and unhappy. And I am thankful for and so I understand that there are environmental factors involved here. And I am thankful for anybody who is willing to take a hard look at that and try and figure out what it is that we are dealing with here. And I see that in the headlines blaming the mothers. And I just absolutely do not feel that way.
That you're saying that's not describing you, Jennifer.
Absolutely not. And in fact, I would say the exact opposite. I am thankful for them looking into these environmental factors. So no, absolutely not. I just don't want to be, and I'm not directing this, Maggie. I don't want to be used as, I'm not a victim.
No.
You know, I don't want to be used as stop blaming the mothers as a roadblock to my daughter getting, you know, the help that she needs. So that's it's a trigger for me to hear that, because I'm behind the science and I'm supporting the science. I would also be curious to know what it is about the research that you feel what do you think is lacking? Where do you take issue with the research?
I am at Hopkins. So the Tylenol study was from a colleague, the one where cord blood. And so I think it's really cool that we're starting to, in like mainstream conversations, talk about all these papers. But that one was also a small N. And I probably, you know, I would cite more recent papers that have now looked at larger studies, and done like the twin comparison study and the things that led up to. And so I think that we sometimes hear that in like main media where we go back and science has moved forward, if that makes sense. Anyway, sorry, B.
No, it's so interesting when like Maggie and Jennifer, who've both really looked at the science and the papers, and I'm sitting here trying to figure out what N is. But I'm wondering, and look, I very much encourage these kinds of conversations, and like Maggie and Jennifer, I'd love for you guys to also offline on some of this stuff, because I think we could certainly have an entire episode just on looking at studies on the science itself. Like, I really encourage us to kind of have more conversations on that. I wonder if I can just quickly have Holden, or is there anything you want to weigh in on just real quick, or?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I would say is, first of all, Maggie's talking about what it takes to get a paper in a journal like ours, the kinds of high quality practices that we have. My problem is similar to hers, and when a politician cherry picks one study out of a whole bunch of others and says, you know, what about this one? And, you know, sometimes it's not one that would have been the one the scientific community would have said had, you know, every little bit of our practices in it. But I think there's another important issue here, which is that scientists prioritize scientific information. To us, that's the most important information. But it's not the only information and knowledge in the world. There's people experiences, there's sociology, there's politics, there's religion. So we're always making what to us seems perfectly logical, but some people seems like an arbitrary decision that we're prioritizing scientific knowledge over everything else. But the experiences that April and Jennifer have had are just as valid. And when we treat scientific information as always prioritized over somebody's experience, then that just makes people trust us less. And so one of the things that I have learned, I used to be somebody on Twitter yelling about, oh, the science says this, what's wrong with everybody? But over the last couple of years, I've realized that that's my decision to prioritize scientific knowledge. Some people prioritize other things. And when I criticize that, that's what causes them to lose trust in this case, science. So I agree with Maggie and what she's saying about what constitutes an excellent scientific study in this area, but I don't think I think that has to be considered alongside the experiences of autistic people and autistic moms and lots of other folks as we work our way through this.
Jennifer had a quick response, and then Rachel.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to say one really quick thing. I think that it's really important, and maybe at another time we can expand on this. I think it's really important to put it out there that the heterogeneity of autism also dilutes the significance. So
what
it's
does that
going to be
mean, Jennifer? Can you explain what you mean when you say that?
Well, we're talking about genetic causes of autism, environmental causes of autism, different degrees of autism. We know rubella virus causes autism, valproate exposure causes autism, maybe Tylenol causes autism, maybe vaccines cause autism. And there are regressive autism, kids who are born with autism, and we haven't really teased out all of the biological underpinnings to sort of compartmentalize all of those different autisms. So what we're doing right now is we're taking the entirety of the autism spectrum as is, and we're looking for significance within those findings of all of those different people. So that's going to dilute the significance. Maybe if you took a cohort of only regressive autism or profound autism, you're going to find significance there where you might not if we're looking at the broader autism community at large. So for that reason, that is going to dilute the significance. It's also going to make it really, really difficult to find causes and to find treatments. And honestly, it kind of makes a large majority of the research that already has been done a little bit null and void, because we're not looking at specific autisms. We're too broad, we're too heterogeneous in the population of people that we are looking at. So I would, honestly, whether it's causes or treatments or Tylenol or vaccines, I would caution anybody to be making like any kind of sweeping generalizations about autism. And I think it's questionable that we are so intent on saying vaccines don't cause autism when all we can look at is population-based studies. And we're looking at the autism. I mean, well, how is that the only finding in decades of research that we are conclusive about? I have questions about that, but I just wanted to say that, I wanted to cast that net over the research because I think that maybe it would help all of us just be a little bit more, not in this conversation, but in the community, humble about our opinions when it comes to autism research.
Hey, Rachel, I know you have a lot to say to get on some of this stuff. And I think I just want to we're going to shift into a different direction in a moment. But before we do that, I want to get your thoughts and just your reaction to just what you've witnessed here. You have scientists talking, you have moms talking, and you're the kind of the bridge in all of this. Get us out of where we're at. We're all just feeling like we're just too scientific, where we know there are emotions at play, but it makes us uncomfortable because we don't want to turn our back to the science. But you're the doctor and you have to do that. And so you have to give me the right answer now.
Okay. I have lots of thoughts. I want to go back, sorry, to even, a couple minutes ago when Brenda said, it felt to me like they weren't ready to come out and say this. And April said, yeah, I think that's right. I think they weren't ready to sort of come out with such a definitive pronouncement, but that there was pressure to do it. And the first thing I want to say about that's interesting to me is we're having this conversation about the science of it and the science and the medicine and whatever. There's a political context, right, in which all of this is being explored. And it's a political context where there are different pressures from different elements of the coalition, where the president wants to have something to say to the country that feels like it fulfills a mandate that he thinks he has. They want to say things that are going to make a lot of news, right? And saying we're going to fast track a leucovorin approval maybe didn't feel like it was enough to them. So that's the first thing that I would say, which is that some of what we're talking about here feels, because of the larger political context, there are just all of these different pressures that are even greater than the pressures from, what's happening in the clinic and exam room, what's happening in families' homes, right? And then the other thing I would say about that is that there were choices made there in that press conference and in the way that the sort of mission of the autism work was set up. So in April, I think, when Kennedy said, we're going to find the cause of autism by September, right? I think it was like in April or May. That was a different intention than if he had said, we're going to begin a huge investment in autism research that's going to continue for the entirety of this administration's term. It was much more definitive. It was like, we're going to come to you with an answer instead of we're about to ask all of these questions. For me, if he had said, we're going to really invest in these questions that people feel have been neglected for a long time, that might have been a more unifying place to start from in some ways, then we're going to talk about the cause. And then I think when he said we're going to talk about the cause because of who he is and how he is perceived by his critics, the assumption was they're going to come out and they're going to say it's about vaccines. And so there was a ton of buildup to that September announcement that was like, he's going to come out and say it's about vaccines. And then when it was about Tylenol and not vaccines, but vaccines were sort of mentioned, it really got people's hackles up. And I wish that it had been a different conversation. I wish that it had been, they made this announcement about a $50 million investment in autism research at the NIH. I wish that had been the headline.
That's a drop in the bucket. Since 2006, we've been investing billions of dollars in research from the Bush administration. We've talked about this before, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and first term. We've been doing this kind of research. I think that I'm curious if, from April and Jennifer, is it that you want not more research? Is it different research that we want? Like, where do you see and Rachel, I didn't try to interrupt you on this, but, we're not just starting, but go ahead.
Can I just answer that just before I want to hear from April and Jennifer also? But the first thing is, I wish that the argument after this press conference had been, that's not enough money. Let's spend more, or let's direct that money differently. Like, I think that's part of the point, Mark, which is that the research investment and what it was going to and how it was going to be spent and how much money was being invested, et cetera, sort of didn't make a lot of news, but maybe could have. And that might have been something that would have spoken to families across the country, regardless of sort of their political position. The other thing that I think didn't come up in this press conference, but I think is really relevant for a lot of families who have kids with autism, especially profound autism, is there's a ton of caregiver burnout. There's a huge amount of financial pressure on families who are taking care of kids. There's a lack of resources around therapy and other things that people need to bring into their homes. There's sort of a ton of focus on figuring out causes, and that is one sort of line of inquiry and investment. And then there are sort of another one around treatments, and that's another line of inquiry and investment. And then there's one that I think hasn't come up that much in the national conversation we've been having for the last month or whatever about this, which is, what does it look like to support families better and to equip them to be able to take care of these kids? And Jennifer, you talked earlier when you introduced yourself about you're thinking about your daughter's future and planning for your daughter's future. And that's something that's incredibly challenging for families who have kids with serious illness or disability. There's sort of all of this opportunity for government to be more helpful there than it currently is. And I wish that had been a more prominent part of the announcement that this administration is going to really invest in supporting families with kids with autism.
I love that. I love that, Rachel. Thank you so much for saying all of that, because it really is casting this super wide net over the care and keeping of this population, not just the why, but it's the how, and it's the moving forward on that because of what you just said, caregiver burnout, the future, the resources. I'm very fortunate to live in California because of the disability supports that California does have. Of all of the criticism I have for how the state is run, the way that the Medi-Cal is run gives families more support than other states. And we really should be looking at all of that with how we are panning out those resources and so forth. And I couldn't agree with you more of how are we going to support? Not only do we have this problem, and yeah, we have studies and we want to back that up. Those are things that holes have been poked in, and no study is really perfect anyway. I agreed with Maggie with the studies aren't always perfect, but it's a place to start looking at this and really shining the light on the lack of resources, on these families that you can't survive on just one income. Insurance doesn't pay. It's a top down thing of what we're doing. And if we're going at this federal budget with DOGE and everything else, there's money there to fund these families. Like what you said, there should be billions of dollars. It should be some sort of match with pharmaceutical companies having kind of like a trust fund, the way that we have the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, of different things that are available for more research and stuff. But I also would say that being in the trenches and being an autism advocate, and I've worked with thousands of families over my 10 years, I volunteered all of my time. I've done, philanthropic work, but also just in the trenches with families and helping, assisting my doctor, that's a functional medicine trained physician here in Northern California. She has a study that we're looking at doing in her clinic that for the last 8 years, she's had 0 instances of autism in her clinic. And those are a population that some of them are vaccinated, and the way that she's been able to do it, there's been 0 instances. And so we need to really look at these other studies, if you will, or just talking with families and doctors around the country to say, what are their findings? And maybe it's not a study, but it's more of a reporting of what's working, what's not, how are we doing this, and doing it under the guise of doctors' offices and other facilities, and really not just looking at studies that take a long time that are these 10-year studies, but actual real time with the technology and the stuff that we have to really take a look at this stuff to say, yeah, how much would it cost per family? And do studies more on financial costs, the burden, the supports. We have all of that available. So I love that you've introduced that into the conversation because it's so relevant. And it's like, I'm already fired up and excited. I'm like, let's go at this. Like, how do we begin doing that to really bridge this with women, families, everybody across the nation to really, with this coalition and everyone getting on board to do just what you're talking about. I'm super excited about that portion of it because it's really what's needed. Because I can't speak for Jennifer, but I know that for me, it's been a very polarizing place to be with families. I have one older child that is biological and she has some chronic health issues, but she's typically developing. And then I have my son. So I have this family that's split, but there's also split resources, right? Of like, where my attention's going to go and so forth. And if I had more support from, the government, the county, whoever that is, or just even an insurance being coded appropriately for me to get the therapies that I'm choosing for my son would be huge. So thank you very much for bringing that into the conversation, because I feel like we so focus on the negative and like what's going wrong in the administration instead of really saying, how else can we support each other in that way, and start looking at those things to press them to do just that.
Within the autism community, are parents of children with severe autism more in favor of finding a cure and putting energy there?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, most of it, and Jennifer touched on it too, is when you live with a child with profound autism, severe autism, nonverbal, you have other behavioral issues. The body is not in alignment. So there's behavioral issues. There's all of these other cofactors of things going on. And so as parents of these children, it's 24/7. We don't get a break. We're in constant fight or flight.
Why
We're in
wouldn't
constant.
why wouldn't that family be advocating for more supports? Like, why wouldn't they want RFK Jr. to get up there and say, we've got research that's been ongoing. We're going to continue to support that. But our big push as administration is to help families cope with children who have severe autism. Yeah, Jennifer, what do you make of that?
I don't feel like there is anything that the government can do for me to help cope. I don't know that I would trust that. I also have a really good situation. I have a great little program that my daughter's in. I trust the people that she's with. For me, when you say cope, I mean, it's more of like an emotional thing, I guess. For me, I just don't think, I guess my philosophy is more, there's that saying that's like, at some point we have to quit pulling people out of the river and go upstream and find out why they're falling in, and for me, I've just never gotten past my daughter regressing right in front of me enough to be on a reactive side of this. I'm still trying to find out, why did she fall in the river? What can we do about it? I think that the biological and medical research takes priority over everything else. That being said, I have the resources to do these things. I cannot imagine being in the situation that I'm in and not having resources.
I mean, Jennifer, it makes sense that you're still very focused on the why. And Holden, I know you've looked into that a little bit, right? You've spoken with a lot of people about, the debate between, do we figure out causes or do we push for support?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, we're also talking about, at least Tom said, about whether to find a cure. And I think, as with a lot of things that we've said here, it's hard to be monolithic about anything in autism, including this. So there are parents of profoundly autistic children that I've interviewed who believe their child deserves a chance to not suffer from the things that they're suffering from, and that science, just like we try to cure cancer or anything else, should work on a way to correct that. But I've also interviewed the parents of profoundly autistic children who feel precisely the opposite. But it's also true. I mean, a lot of people probably think that most folks on the milder end, who tend to identify more with the neurodiversity movement, are adamantly opposed to anything that would read as a correction or a cure. And there certainly are a lot of loud voices saying that. And there are a lot of people who believe that anything, even understanding this, is a threat to their identity. But I've interviewed plenty of people in the middle and to the mildest end of the spectrum who support the idea that not only that we should do research, but also that in some cases where the genetics lines up and where, it might be possible one day that we should do something to help these folks. I mean, I interviewed a guy, Greg Siegel, in a piece that I wrote for Stat, who has a profile pretty similar to mine. He's a researcher. He's right next door to a lab. I mean, he studies the social side of autism mostly, but he's right next door to a lab that's doing, things that are going to perhaps produce gene therapy. And he's completely okay with that. So I just think, like a lot of things that we've been talking about, there's almost nothing you can generalize about how the autism community is going to react to any particular thing.
Rachael, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that autism is particularly complex, I think, but this conversation applies actually to any serious illness, in that there are just an incredible diversity of experiences for people, for patients, for their caregivers. What I think we're speaking about here is the way in which people have genuinely just very different values and priorities that inform the way that they cope with something really difficult in their life. So for some people, getting to a cause feels really incredibly urgent, and that urgency just never goes away because they need to understand what happened. And that's true for Jennifer when she's talking about her daughter, but it's true for some patients when they get diagnosed with a cancer. Somebody gets diagnosed with a cancer who has never had a known risk factor and has taken good care of themselves, and they get diagnosed with a cancer and find it shocking and can spend sort of the entirety of their illness experience feeling really angry about it and really wanting to understand where it came from. Other people experience those diagnoses in really different ways, where instead of being as interested in where it came from, they're sort of preoccupied with elements of what it's like to live with that thing, or they're just sort of dealing with the material needs that the diagnosis introduces in their lives, and that creates a whole different set of issues for them. Which is all just to say that when I think about what it looks like to invest public money in this and create public policy around it, it feels really important to me that we do that in a way that takes that diversity of experience and values into account, and as much as possible gives people a sense of agency about being able to make choices that feel aligned with what they care about. And some of what I hear when I am reading and listening to folks in the MAHA movement talk about their experiences is that they feel like they have not been listened to, and that their experiences have been discounted, or that they've been told that they sort of aren't responding appropriately to what to them is the central challenge and crisis of their lives. I think what resonates a lot about what Kennedy does for that community is he speaks to them in a way that makes them feel heard and honored and taken seriously. And then there are other people, other families, with kids with autism or people who are living with autism themselves who feel that their experience is not being recognized in the way that the current conversation is happening. And that feels pretty political to me. And like, it is the place where I think maybe I kind of keep saying the same thing over and over again, which is that I think the communication around this, regardless of sort of whether you think things are being done in good faith or not, hasn't been as careful as it might be if you are actually trying to sort of bring everybody who is a stakeholder here to the table.
That was really well put. And I want to get Jennifer's response. And Jennifer, I want to also just share with you your quest to find a cause for Kate's autism, your fight and your never ending commitment to it. It really resonates with me because my dad he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday, and he was dead by that following Sunday. And he was healthy and all of that, And I remember it just all happened so fast. And I remember being obsessed with wanting to track those 6 months before he died and everything he ate and what he put in his body, what he interacted with, and maybe the air pollution. And I just I went in this, I know what you're saying, Jennifer. I really do.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I'm sorry to hear about your father.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, and it changes you. There's that, I keep talking about sayings, but is that one saying that's there's life before this and then life after this. You just have those pivotal moments that, put you in a totally different trajectory for the rest of your life. I mean, they're transforming. And actually, that's the third time I think somebody has mentioned cancer in this conversation. And I want to bring up sort of an anecdotal contribution here that I think is pretty impactful. And then it will speak to what Holden was talking about in terms of cures and so forth. So shortly after Kate regressed into autism, my husband's twin brother's daughter, her cousin, was diagnosed with leukemia. So we had this huge confusing situation going on with Kate. And then that came about, and she was ushered to St. Jude and she received treatment. And today she's great, healthy, living a normal life, all of the things. She did end up having a bone marrow transplant. But what I want to tell you about that situation is that there was a boy who was being treated for leukemia 2 doors down from her. I don't know if it was actually 2 doors down, but within close proximity. They were, on this journey together as families. And this boy had autism and leukemia, and he received a bone marrow transplant as well. And he didn't have autism after his bone marrow transplant. Unfortunately, his bone marrow transplant, he ended up getting the graft versus host disease, and he did end up passing away. But, when you talk about should we cure this? Should we not? I don't know that you can know something like that and then say we should not advance medical research. I don't know that you can see something happen like what happened to my daughter and not support medical research. It's one thing to say, I don't want to be cured. I don't want intervention. I don't want this. All I want is supports or whatever. But to actively keep somebody else from that type of treatment and keep to help the narrative persist that they don't need it or their parents are awful for wanting it or whatever. I mean, it is medically neglectful, criminal, I think. I mean, it just blows my mind that anybody, that it would offend anybody that I would want to get help for my daughter. It is unimaginable that there's a whole faction of people out there who are rowing in the opposite direction of me trying to get the help that my daughter needs. So like I said, I think that it's okay for somebody to say, I don't want treatment, but I don't think that just because you're personally, and I'm not saying you, Holden, I know we agree on a lot of things, because you're personally offended or it hinders your agenda. I mean, it is oppression of the worst kind. It's the oppressed oppressing in the absolute worst way. And I think if they even could live a day in our life or understand, I mean, I would hope that that would not be the case. And I also kind of wanted to make, and I know I'm getting off on a little bit of tangent here. I have 1,000 notes over here and a million things to say, but there's also kind of an interesting thing about the spectrum that I've noticed, that while I totally agree that it needs to be compartmentalized for medical research and so forth, in like the social sphere of the autism community, it's kind of interesting because, you know, on one end of the spectrum, you have the parents that want the cure, the profound autism parents, the regressive autism parents. And then on the other end, you have the neurodiversity crowd who, you know, some vehemently oppose what these autism parents are standing for. But the common denominator that they share is that they all believe that people with autism have cognition. Like, I do not think that my daughter is intellectually disabled because she has a communication disorder. She doesn't have a speech disorder. It's a communication disorder. She is unable to even let us know the amount of her intelligence. And I can see her cognition in her eyes. I have so much hope for her. So, you know, I hang on to that other neurodiversity crowd, like through that thread, because they also believe in her abilities and her potential and her capabilities, right? But they're keeping me from what I believe is the avenue for her to maximize her potential and her quality of life. Okay, so you can't really see my hands here, but in the middle of all of that, there is this crowd of people who, mostly parents of profoundly autistic kids, who don't believe their kids have potential. They believe it's all genetic. They don't believe there's a book written called, I think it's called Chasing the Intact Mind, by one of the board members of the Autism Science Foundation and the National Council for Severe Autism, that they don't believe that their kids have potential. It's genetic, it's static, and we disagree on that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm just trying to acknowledge a commonality between the neurodiversity crowd and the profound autism crowd, where we do believe that our kids have potential that is untapped.
Thank
Sorry,
you for
that was kind of a side note and a little bit
really interesting.
Holden, do you want to react to that, to what Jennifer's saying?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that particular point, which is, you know, as I've said already a lot, there's way more agreement than gets represented. I think that, and I think among the parents of the profoundly autistic children that I've talked to, you do have those who, you know, like the autism. I mentioned Allison Singer before. She's the head of the Autism Science Foundation. They're very, very deep in the weeds of the genetics, that's for sure. And then you have folks who do believe, and there are plenty of non-speaking autistic people who do not have an intellectual disability. Some of them are kind of outliers, but you know, there's a famous guy named Hari Srinivasan that I met at Vanderbilt, who's non-speaking, who's going to get a PhD in engineering. And there are plenty of other non-speaking autistic people who can show other patterns of cognition. But I think, you know, in terms of how you lower the temperature, it is a two-way thing, because I guess the thing I wanted to add was one thing that I think would help get the neurodiversity folks who feel strongly that there shouldn't be any research or certainly shouldn't be a cure would be to also accept that, and we haven't heard it on this call, but it can be out there, that what we used to call the Asperger's phenotype is also, we can also see that in the genetics. Autistic traits are on a continuum, and some of us have a whole lot more than others, even though we are verbal and can do many things that we want to do. And I think one of the biggest challenges that, when somebody says, what do you think would help the most, is a better way of figuring out how much autistic people can do. And, a lot of people who have a lot of support who have social challenges or troubles in the workplace, they're working with somebody who pushes them a little bit, and then when they push them too far, they kind of bring them back. Well, that's a very labor intensive thing to do, and not everybody has access to the support for that. So for me, I was pretty good when I was in the lab, but when I ran a whole university, I had a whole lot of challenges. Now, that's a kind of outlier case, but there are other people for whom, driving is really hard, or being in the workplace when people are arguing is very hard. And what we want is everybody to be in the sweet spot of where they're supposed to be. And so if everyone on the spectrum wanted that, then we want Kate to be able to use her intellectual gifts to have a fulfilling life. And we'd want somebody else who is stuck in their mom's basement, who maybe could get out of there and go do more stuff, to have the ability to do that. And I think that's hopefully what we're all striving for.
Thank you for that, Holden. I am aware of the time, so I am going to start wrapping it up. I want to just make one observation before I get some of your thoughts, that just something Jennifer had said earlier that struck me, that the cause of autism is a really deeply divisive issue in our country, and especially when we get into vaccines. And in some ways, I look back at that Andrew Wakefield study in Lancet in 1998 and all the fallout from that and the medical community's response to that. And we're all still sort of living in that response defense era, right? And some of that, I think, is because that study did change behavior. April and Jennifer, I think a lot of folks in the scientific and medical community were worried about how it led to people really questioning the MMR and not getting it and things like that. And I think we're still in that arena where the MMR is sort of driving people's thoughts about autism in a way. And I'm not saying that those conversations, should people have those concerns, that there's not value in it, getting into the science and having that. But what I'm also hearing you say here, this is a very convoluted way of saying, what I'm also hearing you say here is it is a much wider, richer conversation than we are even allowing it to be in this country, even at the MAHA leadership level, quite frankly. And I just wonder if, just for some closing thoughts from all of you, to just sort of describe in a word, a phrase, how you're left right now feeling about autism in this moment. I wonder, April, if we could start with you.
Sure. Yeah. What I would say is, today has been a beautiful conversation with all of us. And what I'm left here today, the big takeaways of more questions about some of the things that I've thought, right? And kind of questioning, okay, well, this kind of opens the door for some other thoughts. I really appreciate that. But also this gives me hope, because we've had such a great conversation today. There's been no, arguments. There's been no, we can still talk about things respectfully, but it gives me hope that I can take away some of this stuff to some of the MAHA leadership and say, these are some of the things that we need. This is the feedback of casting a wider net for supports, so we can support all of the things, the research, the why, the biomedical stuff, where we can really go after policy to get insurance to cover more of these things for families to explore. Like what Holden said, we should have the options to whatever we would like to work on, to have those resources available, because we're here, we're in 2025, and we have all of these beautiful resources with technology coming online, with advances in medical stuff, really coming at autism in a different way of treating it as a medical condition and not just a behavioral DSM-5. Right? We can start looking at these other medical options to treat the symptoms of autism, and we can have it all. I don't think that we could be limited. In this conversation, we don't have to be limited in the scope of what we're looking at for autism. It is a spectrum. And it's not lateral, right? It's everywhere all the time with what we're doing. And the way that we've lumped the DSM-5 of the autism spectrum disorder, I do agree with Holden, and like we need to have different categories of how maybe we come to autism to do further research. But I see no limitations. We can have it all. Let's do it all, and let's bring forward this hope to say, hey, yeah, we can do this, and we can get to the bottom of what's causing it, and people can start to live their best lives. But let's have the supports in place for that. And so that's my big takeaway. So I really appreciate the conversation today to really open things up for me. And I have some big takeaways that I can help my community say, hey, I think this is kind of some of the ways that we need to go instead of being polarizing. Let's join arms, right? And really kind of take this ownership of what we're trying to do and move that forward in a way that we can push public policy and we can start in our own communities. So I just want to say thanks to everyone.
Holden, any closing thoughts from you?
Well, just thanks for including me. I agree with April that it's encouraging when people who are perceived so strongly by the outside world as having such violent disagreements find agreement. And in the work that I do in the autism community, I'm inspired by that every day. I came to this late. I didn't study autism as my science. I'm more of a journalist who covers this and somebody who writes from their own experience. And so the things that people tell me about their experiences with themselves or their loved ones, I find all of it to be absolutely inspirational and human striving. It's wonderful to thank you for pulling the group together that you've pulled here, because I think this is a great synthesis of where we are. And like April said, if we can get past a lot of the politics and the arguing, a lot of things are possible. And that's exciting.
Thank you, Holden. Jennifer, any thoughts from you?
Thank you for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that we even have the chance to do it again to continue it. I think one of the things that stood out to me in the conversation was when Rachael said that I wish that this initiative had been launched with the acknowledgement that we have more questions than answers still. And I think that's important for all of us to acknowledge moving forward.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. Rachael, any closing thoughts from you?
Just echoing that I really enjoyed this and feel like I learned a lot, and feel incredibly grateful to all of you to the hosts for convening this kind of conversation, which I just don't think is happening sort of anywhere else. And you guys do it so consistently. And then to Holden and Jennifer and April for speaking about your experiences and your insights, like with so much, it's just very generous, because it's, even if it's something that Jennifer and April, I know you both talk about this in your sort of work life, that this is not your first time talking about your kids in this kind of context, but it's vulnerable and it's profound. And so I'm really grateful to you both for sharing your experiences. Thank you.
Well, listen, I want to thank April and Rachael and Holden and Jennifer for joining us. These conversations mean a lot to us, and we know they're not always easy, but I hope that they are as meaningful to you all as they are to us. So that is our podcast for today. I am Brenda Adhikari. He is Tom Johnson. He is Dr. Mark. She is Maggie Bartlett. Please send us questions and comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. Check us out on Substack, and we will be right back here next week.